Hey everybody, Maverick Christian here. In my previous vlog episode, I explained why without objective morality, the argument from evil doesn't work. Could the argument from evil be modified so that it works as an internal critique for atheism without relying on objective morality's existence? Part 1. Why there's no problem of evil without objective morality. To briefly recap what I said in my previous vlog episode about why without objective morality the argument from evil doesn't work, here's the illustration I gave. Suppose a theist has a standard of goodness such that it's good that God permits the evil we see, such that if God adopted this standard of goodness, God would allow all the evil in the world. Some atheists might think that if God adopted their standard of goodness, God would not permit all that evil. So in one standard of moral goodness, God would not allow all the evil in the world, but on another moral standard, God would allow all the evil in the world. Well, with no objective moral standard, there is no objective fact in the matter about which standard of moral goodness God would adopt if he existed. And so there'd be no objective fact of the matter over whether God would allow evil if he existed, in which case the argument from evil would thus collapse under its own weight. It couldn't even get off the ground. Does the argument from evil work as an internal critique here? Short answer, no, because even if the hypothetical theist standard of goodness is incorrect, it's not self-contradictory. Without an objective moral standard, the atheist isn't in a rationally coherent position to say that God wouldn't adopt this hypothetical theist moral standard for reasons I explained earlier. I also have an article linked below that goes into more detail. But what if we modified the argument from evil so that it avoids relying on objective morality? Part 2. Modifying the argument. In June 2020, I asked Cosmic Skeptic a question, and long story short, he said this.
Let's not talk about good and evil, because if they're not objective, maybe it's unhelpful. But if you think that God is all loving as a separate point, then the question just reformulates itself. It's not just a question about like what's loving and what's not. It's like we know facts about the universe. We know that children get cancer, and we have to be committed to the view that that is loving, that it is loving to allow a child to get cancer. It's the same problem as saying you have to accept that it is good, or at least not evil, for a child to get cancer. It would just be like framed differently, right? Whatever the person believes, as you say, Cameron, that's probably the best way to answer it. With any argument I ever make on any debate that I do, any video I make, it's always an argument of consistency, pretty much, most of the time. And that's what I'm looking for here, is just consistency. Make it work.
Basically, we can modify the argument from evil so that it's no longer talking about what's morally good and morally bad. Instead of an argument from evil, it's more like an argument from suffering. Instead of talking about what a morally good God would do, we can ask what a perfectly loving God would do, since God being perfectly loving is one of God's essential properties. We know that children get cancer, and Cosmic Skeptic seems to think that the theist would have to be committed to do that it is loving to allow a child to get cancer. But does that follow that if a loving God permits a child to get cancer, that it is loving to allow a child to get cancer? No. For starters, let's ask this question. Why assume that a loving God would not permit suffering? Presumably it's because if you love someone, you value their well-being. It's reasonable that loving someone implies valuing that person's well-being. The problem is that a morally good God might value other things as well, things that interfere with valuing one's well-being. Give an example of how valuing someone's well-being can conflict with another value. Suppose the loving and just judge is tasked with sentencing a man who has committed a heinous crime. The judge loves everyone, including the man she is sentencing, so she values the man's well-being. But on the other hand, she also values punishing those who commit heinous crimes. So the judge gives the man a long prison sentence to pay for his crime, even though she loves the man by virtue of loving everyone and values his well-being, and even though a lengthy prison sentence would decrease the man's well-being. Now obviously the child Cosmic Skeptic has in mind hasn't done anything wrong to deserve cancer. So the loving and just judge doesn't exactly work as a perfect analogy, but it does work to illustrate this point. Values can conflict, including valuing someone's well-being. If God is not just perfectly loving, but also morally good, God could conceivably have other values that supersede the immediate well-being of humans. Imagine a hypothetical theist who believes God is all-loving, but also believes that God is morally good, and that God adopts a standard of goodness such that it is good that God permits the observed suffering we see, even though he loves us all, and that, at least in part because God is all-loving, our suffering in the moral realm is finite, and a pleasant everlasting life is available to every human who freely chooses God. The hypothetical theist, granted, is not loving to permit even that finite suffering, but believes it is good that God permits the finite suffering we observe. God, on this view, has values that supersede the immediate well-being of certain individuals. Now maybe this view of the hypothetical theist is incorrect, but it's not self-contradictory, and so there'd be no inconsistency in the hypothetical theist's conception of goodness with respect to a perfectly good and all-loving God allowing evil. Part 3, Conclusion. The argument from evil fails as an internal critique not just against a morally good God, but an all-loving and morally good God. It's reasonable that an all-loving God would value our well-being. However, a theist could also believe that, while God values our well-being because he's perfectly loving, this is only one of the things that God values, and that other values could outweigh our immediate well-being, such that an all-loving God who is also perfectly moral good would permit the evil we see. I said the argument from evil fails as an internal critique against an all-loving and morally good God, and that by that I mean it's not inherently successful. The problem of evil could succeed as internal critique if the theist really did adopt a standard of moral goodness in which it is not good that God permits the evil we see. So in a way, whether the argument from evil works as internal critique depends on the theist. My objection is that the internal critique is not inherently successful. The theist could easily adopt a standard of moral goodness that evades the problem. Alternatively, theists could also say that while she knows some moral values in this case being, stuff that's morally good, she doesn't necessarily know all the values, much less all values in conjunction with the appropriate weights for each value, such that for all she knows, God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing the evil we see, even if those reasons are beyond her ken. There are many other more complicating factors for whether a morally good God would allow evil, but for now I think this suffices to show how a theist could avoid being self-contradictory regarding God having morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil. This is Maverick Christian inviting you to go in peace, serve the Lord, and love logic.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, hit subscribe and ring the bell.